Welcome. Welcome everybody to the NCPP webinar, Let's Talk Performance. My name is Arun Manoharan. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Public Service and Health Administration, Sawyer Business School, Suffolk University. I'm also the executive director of the National Center for Public Performance at Suffolk University. The NCPP is a research and public service institute established in 1974 by Professor Mark Holzer, who is also in our audience today. The center is focused on improving performance in the public and nonprofit sectors through the publication of educational resources, annual conferences, and certificate programs. The goal of the center is to serve as a vehicle for the study, dissemination, and recognition of performance measurement initiatives in government. Over the years, the NCPP has specialized in research and teaching in related areas such as the engagement of citizens, citizen-driven government performance, developing curricular resources, and delivering online training for public managers. The Let's Talk webinar, Let's Talk Performance webinar was launched in November 2022. The goal of the webinar is to bring practitioners, researchers, and academics to discuss important topics related to public performance management. Today, our webinar features Professor Katherine Willoughby, the Golombiski Professor of Public Administration and PhD Director, the School of Public and International Affairs, University of Georgia. Professor Elaine Liu, Professor and Director, John Jay College of Criminal Justice, the City University of New York. Their book, The Public Performance Budgeting Principles and Practice, has been selected as the Best Book Award for from the Association for Budgeting and Financial Management. We're also pleased to have Mr. Greg Useem, the Chief Performance Officer, City of Alexandria, Virginia, and the Director of the Office of Performance Analytics, joining us to moderate the discussion. Now I'll hand it over to our Managing Director, Brian Bates, to introduce the participants.
Hi, so thank you. As Arun said, I'm the Managing Director here at the National Center for Public Performance and also an alumni of the MPA program here at Suffolk University Sawyer Business School. Just first things first, we just ask that everyone please stay muted the entire time so that the panelists and the moderator may talk the entire time, and then we can all have a great time while we're listening to it. And if you have any questions, we're going to leave room at the end for question and answers. If you want to submit those through the chat function, and I can get those to Greg so he can ask them of the two panelists at the end of the conversation. So like Arun said, the book we'll be talking about today is Public Performance Budgeting, Principles and Practice, that won the inaugural Best Book Award in 2022 from the Association for Budgeting and Financial Management. The first author is Dr. Elaine Liu, is a full professor and director of public policy and administration at the City University of New York, John Jay College. Her primary field of study is fiscal policy and performance accountability. She engages or has engaged with professional association in various capacities on numerous occasions. Currently, she is the editor-in-chief of the International Journal of Public Administration, the mobility of students, promoting leadership among people from all walks of life, particularly those underrepresented in leadership of public service. And she is also a graduate of the University of Georgia. We are also joined by Katherine Willoughby. She has spent the last 30 years teaching, conducting research, and consulting regarding public management, budget, and finance. She has internationally recognized expertise of the legal foundation's use of effects performance budgeting on the United States management, budget, and finance. She's also the co-author of numerous books, journal articles, book chapters, and reports about public management, budgeting, and government performance. Katherine also has an extensive background in consulting with the training of management, budget, finance, and other government officials from around the globe regarding budget and management best practices. She is a National Academy of Public Administration Fellow and was recently selected as the new co-editor-in-chief of Public Administration Review, the premier outlet of scholarship and practitioner reviews in the field. We are also joined today by Greg Useem, the director of the Office of Performance Analytics at the City of Alexandria, Virginia, located in the Washington, D.C. metro area. Greg has more than 15 years of expertise and experience leading government organizations and teams in analytics, performance measurement, and budget. Greg is also the co-founder and co-chair of the Mid-Atlantic StatNet, a consortium of governments working to further the state of data-driven government. He also earned his bachelor's degree in political science and history from Lynchburg College and is a master of public administration from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. I will hand it over to Greg to start.
Thank you. Let me just do a quick sound check. Everyone can hear me, yes? Okay, great. All right. Well, thank you for joining us today. Congrats again on this very insightful book. Can you share with us your research, teaching interests, and current projects?
Elaine?
Sure. I consider myself in research two lines. One is performance, one is budgeting and financial management. And the book that Katherine and I did happens to be the marriage of those two lines of research. Another way to put it is I consider my research is on the continuum of governance. On one side, it's about how to promote good performance. You know, the book about criminal justice, juvenile justice that we just did is basically on that field. But on the other end, it is about how to curb bad performance. And this is where how to combat corruptions and Inspector General, this line for research fills in. So that's who I am. And I'm not teaching because I'm directing a program, but I would love to teach, public budgeting, the finance, as well as a research methodology. Katherine?
Yeah, so same for me. I of course, study public budgeting and finance and performance, government performance. I've also branched out over the last couple of years into disaster management and emergency management in a pretty significant way, looking at local government reactions to COVID and to weather-related disasters. So that's a kind of a new line of research for me as well. I'm also segueing into social equity and budgeting, and have conducted some work on state and local budget practices that support advancing social equity. So that's an avenue that has been pretty fruitful lately, as you would expect. So budgeting, performance, specifically related to these days disaster and emergency management and social equity applications. In addition to Elaine and I are continuing our work on performance budgeting by drilling down into specific states. In teaching, I teach public management and public financial management and budgeting courses, both graduate and PhD level, master's and PhD level courses in my department here at Georgia. And by the way, both Elaine and I are graduates of Georgia with our PhD, and both of us studied under Dr. Tom Law. So we feel grateful to him for 15 years apart, I'll say that. And I also right now I'm directing our PhD program. So I kind of have a lot going on.
Well, that's great. Thank you so much for sharing that. So Elaine, Katherine, what motivated you to write the book on public performance budgeting principles and practice? How long did it take you, and any interesting experiences that you'd like to share with us about it?
Well, I'll start. I mean, we have a long-standing interest in looking at budget reform, and we've got a long collaborative relationship in terms of studying performance budgeting laws in the states, work that I began with Julia Melkers in the 1990s, and then Elaine was able to pick up the rope and go with me on that in the 2000s. So we've got kind of extensive work in that area, and we thought we wanted to look deeper into it as in addition to studying laws, what comes of those laws. So how do they impact implementation and what happens? And we picked the area of juvenile justice because it's a dramatically changing area of service delivery from incarceration in facilities to natural care or care in the community. It's also highly expensive. In spite of declining populations in facilities, it can be upwards of $300,000 a year to manage youth in a facility and through programming. So that was another reason. And then finally, because performance in these programs has been rather abysmal in the past, with recidivism rates, however it's defined by a state, being pretty high, upwards of 50%. So all this money going in to this very important public service and programming that is really impacting our future generation of productive citizens in the world. So that was an important component of us deciding to work on this. And Elaine, I'll let you talk about different.
Sure. Yeah, I wanted to follow up on that. I think, Katherine summarized it beautifully. And one thing particularly drives me is the realization that maybe the field is suffering from too many variables. Like when we talk with interviewees, they mention the variable A and the research information, the variable B, and all of a sudden there are like 20 or 30 factors that people are identified as important in managing this massive process called the performance management, right? And we were curious to know like how we structure this. How a practitioner, if someone wants to implement this, what lessons would they draw from the current existing literature? And that's one of the reasons we say, look, let's go out and see what are the ways out there that we can better structure this implementation. And one way that we emphasized on, and we find it effective, is to have performance management legislated in a way, not detailed, not universal, but in a way that's helpful to structure the implementation of a performance management. And also along the way, we wanted to bridge the gap between theory and practice. Now, both Katherine and I come from a background with, literatures, and we keep track of every single year. But how this connects to the field of a practice, we wanted to assess it. We wanted to propose something that, in our mind, could be helpful for the next round of a theory and a practice dialogue. And obviously, it never hurts to work with, someone that you really enjoy working, people like Katherine. So that's another impetus for the project.
And some of the things that were really interesting to me, we have innumerable stories in the book about the management and budgeting in these juvenile justice agencies. But two things were especially gratifying to me. One, collectively, the folks we interviewed who are managing these programs and working in these programs across the nation, collectively have given 350 years worth of experience to the field of juvenile justice and care of youth. And the second thing is that they remain highly optimistic and very, very committed to their work and to the importance of measuring what they do and making assessments and continuous improvement. So that was very energizing to us, because we fully expected to hear lots of skepticism and a lot of, yes, we provide these reports, but legislators don't ever use it, and we do what we have to do for compliance, which is of course important. So I would say the commitment of these public servants in this very difficult field was wonderful to see, and then their optimism and hopefulness in being able to change lives.
Thanks for sharing that. I picked up a couple of times you both saying, and Elaine, I think, said this specifically, that part of your work here is to bridge theory and practice. So let me ask a follow-up question around that. How do you see the gap between practitioners and academics, both in terms of research and teaching, in the realm of public performance budgeting? And has it been converging and diverging over the last decade or so?
I mean, personally, I think it's been diverging. And I think it's very difficult for practitioners to pick up something like PAR and read it and have takeaways from it. And so I think it's been a difficult thing to truly integrate theory with practice. That's been an important push of mine and throughout my career, and relates to my consulting that I've done worldwide. So I do think that academics are coming around to the realization that they have to make their research accessible. And one important component of our book is the stories we tell. We're not listing a bunch of how-tos. We're telling exactly how different governments are implementing and using a performance budgeting system. No system is complete, no system is the same, and no application is the same. So our book kind of celebrates the distinctive aspects related to implementing something in a unique environment, which every government is unique. And so I think academics need to come around, continue to come around to, it's more than a regression. It's more than a difference in difference study. Yeah.
Well, I would also say I think there are pockets of optimism, where research and the practice kind of come together. I think this year is the 30th year after GPRA, right? And we have been on it for a long time. And I think the process is sort of like people are touching the elephant. The elephant is performance management and budgeting from different sides for all these years. But finally, I think there are pockets of place and pockets of optimism where people see actually, wow, these are all parts of the elephant. And we are beginning to see the bigger picture of what elephant actually looks like. Now, this is our attempt in studying the law, so to speak. Picture it big and picture it comprehensively, holistically. And so that both sides can see, sort of what the elephant looks like. Now, the other thing I find interesting is that in our conversation with interviewees, I find that their questions are very down to earth. They're talking about like how to motivate people, how to build a capacity. Can anyone help us to start? How to sustain the reform? And what are the best practice that I can learn from? Right. So I think these are the questions that it seems to me, benefited me and Katherine in the process as to how we direct our future research. And I personally think, in order to bridge these two, any research that we do, we need to have a component called interviewing. We need to have a component called dialogue, and that it must be there so that what we're proposing is not only valid on in a box on our resume, but it's valid to anyone who's thinking about doing and implementing performance management. At the end of the day, like Katherine, opening with the sentence that we are hopeful. I think we, at the end of the project, we come away with the sense that regardless we like it or not, we think it's beneficial or not, we think it's exercise or not, it is here to stay. It is here to stay. Performance is here to stay. And probably in the next, decades, or it will become more and more important. Right. And the performance is not only a way of, organizing stuff, but becomes an aspiration that government will, want to say, I can perform and I perform well. And that's actually the title of the first chapter of the book. It's a mission. Performance is a mission that every government aspires to.
That's very, very helpful. Let me take a moment here, and somebody has posted a question in the chat, and I'm going to read it out for response. And just a friendly reminder to continue to do that as Elaine and Katherine bring up interesting points and things that you all want to follow up on. We do want to make sure that this is a bit of a discussion here as well. So let me read out the question here. What is the universal approach with regards to better performance of policy and budget? Because diversified societies having different results. When policy is performance-based, budget should be spent rationally, but unfortunately, yielding different results in different societies when performance-based budget is put into practice. Why?
I mean, I would say, first of all, there is no universal application. Of course not. As noted, I would say there's continuous improvement. I mean, if you look at, for instance, the state of Arizona has had performance law, budgeting law in place since the 1990s, and they have continually, evolved that law to accommodate different things. First, having annual budgets, then all agencies going to biennial budgets, then splitting some agencies as biennial and others as annual. Moving from simple measurement development to development of strategic plans and incorporation of measures within strategic plans. And, over time, and we see this across many governments, the initial passing of a performance budgeting system, or I will say a performance management system, and then a layering on top of that, an evolution of the law as needed and as considered. The number one important component, I will say a universal component, is passing legislation to develop a performance budgeting system is we found to be very important to a system being developed and a system maturing and becoming more and more effective. So that provides that shared commitment on the part of the legislature and the executive in carrying forward the mission of a performance budgeting system, which, let's be clear, should be performance informed, but not performance based. I know early in my career, I used performance-based, as many others did, and realized pretty quickly that we can't use performance-based. It shouldn't be based solely on performance. Of course not. Our governments are political systems, and we need that politics to be legitimate. But on the other hand, we can be better informed about decisions, and by passing laws, it tells us that legislators are at least open to getting more information about how they want to proceed with budgeting in the future.
Yeah, I really appreciate the question. I think the question, how can we yield the different results in different societies, right? I think this is such an important question. And this is also the question I think me and Katherine are sort of focusing on and trying to get to some level of better understanding. And one thing that we realized is the study of context. Mm-hmm. And just give you an example, even you would think that we are studying juvenile justice in one type of services. There should be a lot of consistency around how they implement this, what are the outcomes of a performance management. But it turns out it varies too, right? It varies from state to state. And one specific example that I remember vividly is that they say the culture of the state, how they view delinquent juvenile, delinquent youth is a factor in how they implement performance management. Do you come to this with the conception of we discipline delinquent youth or we serve delinquent youth? These two cultures will lead to dramatically different performance indicators. And this is exactly, I think, the context understanding is important. The culture, the process they use, the political structure, even the mix of a private and public services. In some of the states, they say, oh, what's important in our state? Lobbyists, because many of our services are privatized. Mm-hmm. So I think this round of research, it does not give us like a clear understanding as to why they are different, but it does give us a general understanding about the factors that could possibly lead to different outcomes when we're implementing on the paper seemingly similar concepts of a performance management and budgeting.
I mean, one thing we highlight in our book is the distinction between the systems, juvenile justice systems in Delaware and California, which are obviously very different. Two states that are different fiscally and operationally and structurally. And, Delaware, a small state with a small budget, certainly compared to California, and runs a highly centralized juvenile justice system, whereas in California, it runs locally organized and operated system. And both of these states have what we term as thin performance budgeting law, which is not robust in providing guidance along every aspect of a performance budgeting system, from measurement development to audit and accountability. And, these two states operate very differently. You would think maybe on the face of it that California would be able to do more with more money. But in the end, Delaware is able to illustrate use of measures and some progress and advancement in juvenile justice, some successes, whereas California's it's got too many competing competing problems and complexities, and measurement. We didn't see measurement used at all in that system. So, it's kind of interesting to look at. That speaks to what Elaine was saying, that all the many factors that can come into play in individual governments and agencies.
Thank you. There's a lot of great discussion and questions in the chat. And I will keep going to those because I think it's leading to some interesting additional avenues here. Someone asked, to what extent are federal grant programs, in this case specifically the Justice Department, requiring recipients to measure and report performance, specifically for the juvenile justice programs?
Well, they are, of course, but as I said earlier, every state measures, for instance, recidivism differently. And so, it's a bit problematic. And, just reducing your youth in the system can be complicated. We talked to one state, the agency head that talked about the fact that youth in the facilities were counted, and who had been recommended from the court system, but youth into the system from their parents or a friend or otherwise were not counted in the system. So there are problems with counting that go on that can be murky for comparability across all programs nationwide. That's not to say that, of course, there needs to be accountability of programming when you're receiving grant funds, and it's a continual push and pull to get those numbers. And those we talk to were constantly working on their numbers because and their metrics, because they let us know in no uncertain terms if we lose our position as trustworthy in terms of providing reliable and valid data, we will get nowhere. And at the very least, from a fellow in Wyoming, he said, we must present these performance indicators to keep our funding. It's as important to keep our funding as it is to try to improve our funding or to forestall cutting our budget. So they see the need for it. They want to, they are continually working on these metrics.
Yeah, I think it really depending on the states. Some of the states that we interviewed, I think they would tell us that those performance indicators were written into the contracts, where the grant contract, contracts with contractors. So it's sort of it's there. However, the standards for those measurement, it is negotiable. I think that's, standards needs to be there, measures needs to be there, but the standards is negotiable. It's in the contract, depending on how this is being negotiated. If this is the case of with contractors, if this is a case of a federal grant, they come with some kind of general guideline in terms of performance reporting already. So I would say this is going to be always there, we just all agencies or contractors or recipient of grants will need to think about what are the ways that we can measure the impact of our work.
So speaking of and following on to that about indicators, we have a question regarding the New York State Government Finance Officers Association is going to be holding a conference here, their annual conference here in the spring. And for the first time, they're going to be talking about strategic planning and performance measurement for local governments. Do you have any suggestions on how to present performance measures as part of the program for local governments?
Yeah, that's a toughie. Yeah, I'm thinking about, California's recent initiative. I think there's a bill that's going to require local governments to provide return on investment metrics for homelessness to be able to get grant money. So, it's very important to define what you mean by that and, how you can make the case. So I think, we can probably all agree on, several metrics that would be important for any topical area. In the case of juvenile justice, for instance, recidivism. And then we have to have a good understanding, a good survey of how do the states measure that? And can we all circle around a particular measure or come to grips with it? Or will it take a couple of measures to figure that out? So it's not something that, one thing I learned in all my consulting is you can't go, drop something in the lap of the recipient and say, okay, we need this data and we need it this way. It's just not going to work like that. So you have to understand what are the biggest, issues for individual governments. And, I always would say, what are the top 2 things that you've got to deal with? And some would say, employee retention and retirement. Others would say, performance, and, it was all kinds of things. So yeah, I think you need to have an understanding of how are local governments measuring that policy issue or their return on investment, and then figuring out if there are several measures to offer up that could coalesce around that.
Yeah, I would say definitely, knowing New York State, I think one thing, or any local government in a state, one thing they would definitely need to pay attention to in implementing performance management or strategic planning involving performance is the issue of a capacity. Mm-hmm. The issue of a capacity. I think the fact that the Finance Officers Association are doing something, in this field is already a very good indicator that people are paying attention to capacity building. Right. So I think whatever it's being talked about in those training sessions need to make people realize that capacity is something that you have to consider in your process of designing a performance management system and thinking about developing performance measures. Right. That's number one. And the other thing is set proper expectations. And I think many of the discussion that we have here is really centered around performance-informed budgeting and not about, based budgeting. And I think the potential of a performance indicators, particularly those system-wide indicators for strategic planning. The potential of those indicators for strategic planning is tremendous. If tremendous. I think it drills down to one thing that people keeps talked about. Now, what's the impact of performance management? And one of the things they will say to you is it's a symbolic impact. And what that means is a government is paying attention to performance. And that is, that is the value of performance management in strategic planning, setting the tone, setting how important the performance it is for a government. And the last but not least, I will mention dialogue. This process cannot and should not be a top-down version. Like, oh, by the way, here's your measure and here's your standards. It never works that way. In our survey, Katherine and I can attest to it. One of the indicators people say they're more likely to use performance indicators are they feel they have a voice in deciding them. So that kind of surprising in a sense that because a lot of people talking about better measurement is more, talking about this from the perspective of technicality. But we argue a better performance is a performance indicator that has been talked about, has been communicated, has been negotiated. It's sort of a bottom-up process in addition to top-down. The dialogue between the upper layer and the agency operational personnel must be present for that indicator to work. So capacity building, looking at the impact of performance in strategic planning, and focus on dialogue. These are the three things that I think would be very, very important for local government taking on this gigantic task.
Really good questions in the chat, and we'll come back to them in just a moment. I just want to follow up on, we're talking a lot about, this practitioner in theory coming together, and how do we execute these initiatives effectively. So I'd like to follow up on how can we better bridge those two domains, and how does your book contribute to that direction?
Well, I mean, just this event right here is a movement in the right direction. Getting practitioners and academics together is very important. I do know that out there in the cyber world, there are more, interesting podcasts and lots of, conducted by NAPA and other organizations that offer up practitioner viewpoints with some follow-up of a scholar who may be studying the topic. So that's one thing. But also faculty and academics engaging with practitioners in the development of systems or bringing a new eye to a system. Many governments have someone come in, or even a class of MPA students, and analyze one of their systems and at least get some fresh eyes on it. So the integration of schools of public affairs with practitioners is vitally important. And as I said earlier about our book, telling stories. Practitioners want to hear other stories. What did they do? What did my neighbor do? They want to hear about it. They know they can't implement everything, and they want to see, what was important to make something happen. And as we all know, success in managing through a disaster, managing a program, is the coming together of a number of different factors. And what we found with performance budgeting is staying on the road and keeping with the practice is vitally important, even though the practice and its use changes and evolves over time by virtue of those coming into the positions of managing these programs. But those external circumstances change, as do internal structural and operational. So I think, there is, I'm very hopeful about what I see as what really was jump-started with COVID was this closer attention by academics with practitioners to support better governance and better return on investment.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think for both of us, we have done, different things to foster the connection between theory and the practice. And I think that work is coming from both ends toward the middle. And in our work, I think there are two things important. One is research synthesis, and the other is practice synthesis. Now, by research synthesis, I mean is like there are hundreds of articles out there each year on this topic. The reason I know is because I'm the chair of the Joseph Holy, research award chair, and we did hundreds of articles each year. And I don't think people who are really implementing the performance management, they have that kind of time span to look over hundreds of articles. So I think the responsibility of researchers like us is to really do a research synthesis, on a yearly basis, or on regular basis. What do we learn from this year's publication? And that's what I mean by research synthesis. And I think the synthesis itself should be written in a very practical language, and not doing any regression, hopefully, or any kind of sophisticated research methodology. No offense to that, but I think for the purpose of a dialogue, for the purpose of communication between these two fields, I think how to communicate the research in plain language in a comprehensive and applicable way is a skill. Now, the other part is a practice synthesis. One thing I learned from this process is that people are very, very interested in best practices. And particularly, they are interested in gap analysis. Now, what I mean by that, people are asking, oh, what is the program that other states have that we don't have could possibly help with the work that I'm doing here? The gap analysis. So what that tells me is that we need to have some kind of a mechanism in place that we will be able to do regular practice synthesis. Now, one of the good example is what my good friend, John, Kamansky has been doing. He put out every single Monday a list of practices on performance management and budgeting, sometimes compliance, sometimes inspector general, but related to performance management. Every Monday, he sends out the list of what has been happening with different states, different organizations, different think tanks. I think this is critical for governments to sign on to those, enjoyable reading. It's not too
just
long.
A blog, it's just a blog, regular blog.
Exactly. So these are the research synthesis and the practice synthesis that they need to connect. Yeah. They need to connect. So I'll just leave that.
Thank you both. That was great. Let me pivot back to some of the questions that are popping up in the chat here. One of them is certainly in the news more lately. ChatGPT and AI has been of high interest lately. And so I'm going to try and paraphrase this question. Please pop in the chat if I'm misrepresenting it. But it seems to be a question around how do we prioritize or consider the choices and trade-offs between AI-driven tools and employees, our human capital?
Well, I think one way we've kind of suggested is, as Elaine noted, this constant dialogue. Here at the university, of course, we're grappling with these AI and GP chat stuff. And it can be frightening and upsetting, but it's all an attitude, and I say accept it. And in class, have assignments where you say you're going to use GPS chat, and let's come up with something, or put your computers away and I want you to write a paragraph. So, you know, so I think we need to, you know, be cognizant of these and celebrate them in some circumstances, but also always maintain that dialogue requirement and get people talking and used to talking about metrics and their development and their evolution.
Mm. Well, I like this angle of technology and the potential, right? It's just like, you know, I think this is a treasure box, but it could also be a Pandora box. I think this is a both, right? And in the current state, knowing what we have known, I think the human aspects of a performance management is always going to be there. And I don't think that the current state of AI would be able to deliver that level of sophistication yet. Maybe in the future, yes, but not right now. Because for instance, I did actually do an experiment. I went on GPT and I said, what's the current status of a performance-informed budgeting? And they give me 3 bullet points and very general. Then I asked them, what's the contribution of Elaine in performance-based performance-informed budgeting? Because that's how I know whether or not it's accurate, right? And it gives me very general, again, very general responses. Some of them may not be correct in my own opinion because I don't do this, you know. The point I'm making is that the current status of AI, I don't think it will provide those contextualized recommendations in the implementation of performance management. Now, going back to the comments that we talked about, 30 minutes ago, why are we observing varying impact of performance management and budgeting? Well, context and measures. And AI in its current state probably will not be able to consider that. Now, if I have to speculate, what is the potential for application of AI in performance management? I would speculate in 2 ways. One is the standardization and the digitalization of a performance information. Now, you would think of criminal justice as filled with data. But guess what? Those data, yes, lots of them, they don't comparable. Anybody who works in this field, even the definition of a recidivism is varying across the states. So how use AI to kind of standardize, digitize all these data, performance data is one potential. And the other potential that AI can really make a difference is to link cost data to performance data. And that's something I would say it's almost non-existent right now because those 2 systems don't normally talk to each other, and we cannot understand the impact or implement performance management very well if we don't know the answer to the question, at what cost a given performance is achieved. We have to answer that question. Because in the end, if we're paying 100% double the cost to achieve a 5% increase of a performance, do we want to do it? Right? So we kind of have to link the performance with the cost so that we can understand at what cost is a performance is achieved. This is a technical question. This is also a political question, right? So political question, we have politicians, they can figure that out. But technically, how can we figure that out? But I would say right now, the question is unanswered.
And I will add that, as we noted earlier, those we talked to, they're experts and they're looking very carefully at this data and continually assessing it and making nuanced changes to measurements that are important for them to get their message across, both to, in this case, the governor, as well as to the legislature, and then for their own consumption as they execute the budget. So I'm not sure that AI can, really, have that continual avenue to massage the numbers and their actual calculation, development and calculation in a way that keeps these metrics useful and relevant.
Well, certainly an important and obviously evolving discussion on this topic. There's a couple questions around this, and let's come back to this idea about, you both have mentioned there's a number of stories from practitioners on performance budgeting or performance-informed budgeting. Can you share with us a bit about what has worked and what has not worked? Give us a couple specific issues facing governments and the public sector in implementing this kind of performance management or performance-informed budgeting system.
Well, what we did find was we looked at application of performance budgeting across the 4 stages of the budget process: budget development, budget deliberation and passing the budget, execution, and audit. And it was very interesting to us that we found that states with performance budgeting law that emphasized the specific stage were more likely to conduct work in that area. So what do I mean by that? In Ohio, they have performance budgeting law that requires agencies to present performance information at the budget development level in their request, or their request will not be considered. So we saw very high use of performance measures and the application of it in the development stage for, explaining, justifying their budget for strategic purposes. And then moving to the legislative stage, we found in Louisiana and in Utah, states with laws that emphasize presentation of performance data and information at the legislative stage, that indeed these states concentrated on those areas to a high degree, but in different ways. In Louisiana, we saw that legislators didn't tend to use the information as much as those legislators did in Utah, according to the agency personnel we were talking to. At the execution stage, we found that in Idaho and in Arizona, those states have laws that have high expectations for responsibility of presenting performance information at the execution stage, and we saw exceptional use by Idaho and Arizona of performance measurement and performance budgeting for execution that ranged from not only tracking, of course, and benchmarking, but also reshuffling staff and actually rebudgeting. And then finally at the audit stage in South Carolina and Colorado are states that have law that has very definitive requirements for the audit, performance audit. In South Carolina, agencies must provide an accountability report at the end of the year. And that we found that South Carolina agencies utilize those reports heavily for then developing their budgets in the subsequent year. Looking back, they're looking back to look forward, and the legislators use those. So there is some great intel there for a government seeking to establish a system to understand that the definitive aspects of law can help focus folks on the concentration that's going to be most helpful, again, in that collaborative relationship between executive and legislative.
Yeah, Katherine mentioned a lot of things, what works. Let me share a little bit about what does not work. Well, I think, one thing we all know is if you come to this performance management project with the expectation of a mechanical link. That does not work, right? I think we covered this in the prior minutes. And the second thing that does not work is do too much at one time. What we learn is that this is a gigantic project. It takes time, because what needs to be moved at the center of this project is not numbers or people. And it takes time to manage the change. And if you're really talking about the impact on budgeting, and you try to correlate the performance activities that you're doing and the final budgeting, most likely, also evidenced by our own research, is that there's no direct link between these two. Now, where the possible link could appear between performance and budgeting over a long period of time, because the missing link in between is how we go from understanding of performance that leads to policy change, and that the policy change triggers budgeting. So that change needs to take a very, very long time. You cannot expect that the impact will be over time, and we cannot do too much at a given time, because we're moving people, not moving, cargoes. Last but not least is what does not work is if the project focuses too much on technicality, not on culture building. That will not work. The capacity, the technical aspects of it, the cultural aspects of it has to merge together, and has to merge in such a way that would be correlating, these two processes together, become an operational manual. How you incorporate performance with the daily task, the daily process. And that's the operational aspects of it. So anything that's focused too much on technicality, not enough or not at all on culture building, it's going to be a tough uphill battle that we may not win at all. So I think one of the things that Katherine and I summarized in the book is, for any projects, performance management projects, to be successful, it needs to focus on 3 sets of activities: cultural, technical, operational. Now, for any government who's thinking about that, we need to think about, are we doing something in each of those 3 categories? Do we have a key behavioral change that aimed at cultural change, that aimed at operational integration, that will help us get to the better performance indicators through technical aspects of the work? So these 3 things, culture, operational, technical, these 3 things have to go together, instead of saying, oh, let's have, just talk with a think tank, or talk with, no offense to think tank, or no offense to researchers or external people. An external driven process may not work. It has to be an internal driven process.
And these things are, relatively not simple to do, but one method is, of course, starting small, and starting, if you were developing law, that you assign responsibilities for metrics, and then that law can be built on over time. Also applying the system to a sample of agencies and programs, and having a goal of, in 7 years, we're going to be, complete. So as a nod to capacity, government capacity. So, there are reasonable things that can be done to inculcate an organization with a culture and a commitment to a performance system.
Well, thank you both for those insights. I hate to have to leave it here, but to be respectful to people's time, we're at the 12 o'clock mark. I know there's a lot of outstanding questions I still had and others had as well. My suggestion would be, we are sticking email addresses and phone numbers in the chat. Please reach out to follow up. And Elaine and Katherine, thanks again. Absolutely terrific insight today. Thanks all for joining us this morning and now this afternoon. Have a
Thank
good
you.
day.
Appreciate it. Thanks
Yeah.
a lot.
You again for a wonderful discussion, the three of you. Your discussion touched upon several different topics based on your experience with the book, and also focusing on the integration of strategic planning and related topics. Also looking forward, the discussion of AI, Chat GPT. So this has been a really great discussion. This is the purpose of this webinar, trying to bring practitioners and academics together. And I think today you did a great job in really addressing this important topic. I also want to thank the audience for the wonderful questions. I think we've had a very engaging discussion. This could have even gone for 2 or 3 hours. But we are definitely going to post the questions, post the discussion on our YouTube channel, and we'll also post about the webinar. Thank you, everybody.
I also would like to thank Mark Hauser. He is a mentor of mine and also a champion in the field of performance management. So thank you, Mark, for being here.
Thank you, Ryan. Thank you, Katherine. I think you're doing, terrific work, and I've gotten a lot of ideas from what you're talking about here. It's very much in line with what needs to be done in the future. So.
Thank you, Greg, for moderating this, and also Brian and Arun for organizing this. Thank you.